Okay, so I'm going to show you here how to drag your photos into Photoshop to get them formatted and sized correctly for your digital portfolio submission. You'll see on Carmen in the brief that it says you need to photograph and edit to create good quality images of your 16 squares that you mounted and turned in for your final project. And there are more instructions on Carmen about how to do that. So for these purposes, I'm just going to demonstrate how you want to bring your images into Photoshop to get them sized correctly and make sure they're good quality and ready to be turned in. So if you want to just drop your photos onto the desktop, or if you have them on a USB or in a folder, however you want to do it, that's fine. Just find your image, and there's a couple different ways to get them pulled into Photoshop. So option number one will be to right click your image so that you get this menu, and you can go to open with, and typically if Photoshop is on the computer that you're using, it'll show up here. The computer will recognize it, and you can tell it to open your image with Photoshop. Or your other option is to just drag your image over the Photoshop icon and it will automatically open for you. So we see it here. So if you notice right now, there's a grid turned on over my entire image that I'm looking at, and that allows me to sort of see if things are lined up correctly. Typically when you open Photoshop, it's likely going to look like this, right? The grid won't be there. So I would recommend when you very first open your image, going to View and then going down to Show and just click Grid, and now the grid will show up like it was when we very first opened. It'll just be helpful for you later on. So when you bring your image in, if you bring it in like I showed you how to do, it's going to be sized just however the imaging device that you took the photo with sized it originally. And it's important that you just pull it in, because if you try and like copy and paste the image in, it'll potentially distort it or bring down, like it could compress it, and then you're not going to have as good quality of an image to work with. So now that we have our grid turned on, we're going to start by going up to Layer, and we're going to go down to Smart Objects, and we're going to click Convert to Smart Object. So basically what that's doing, before you click Smart Object, it won't allow you to use any of the editing tools. By clicking Smart Object, it's going to retain the quality of your image when you go to edit it and keep strange distortions from happening. So now you have it as a Smart Object. You're going to go back to Layer, scroll down, and go to Rasterize, which is right under here where you click Smart Objects before. Just going to go to Rasterize and then click Smart Object. And rasterizing is just telling it to convert your image back to pixels so that you have the ability to manipulate it. Okay, so now that we've prepped our whole image, what we're going to want to do is see how these corners aren't quite lined up, right? So our image is close to square, but not quite. There's a little bit of curvature here. See where it doesn't line up with the grid. I'm imagining that that's just because the image wasn't completely flat when I photographed it. So you're going to want to make sure that your squares are as flat as you can get them when you're photographing, so that you can get that to be entirely square. Okay, so now that we have prepped that, we're going to go up to Edit, and we're going to scroll down to Transform, and you're going to come up with a couple different options here. You can adjust the scale, rotate your image, you can change the perspective, you can warp the image. We're really only going to be working with skew and perspective most likely. But feel free to play around with those if you're not familiar. They could be useful to you in some way, so it's good to know that they exist and sort of how they work. So let's start with, I would start with adjusting the perspective, so we're going to click that. So now we have the ability, if we zoom out so we can see our whole image, you can see now you have all these handlebars here that surround the image. You can click those and drag them to adjust things. So I'm going to start up here in this corner. I'm going to sort of just drag this out and see how that corner locks in to this grid, right? So now that corner is squared off. We're a little bit wonky up here and down this side, so I might try and adjust that a little bit. We're fairly square coming down here. The bottom looks fairly straight. I might try and pull this corner out a little bit. But you sort of have to watch when you're using perspective, because if you saw, as soon as I adjust one thing, it adjusts everything, right? Because it keeps it squared up, which is where your other tools come in, right? So I'm going to undo that adjustment. If you hit Command Z on a Mac computer, then it will just take you back one step to where you were before, right? So this corner's lined up again. That's probably about all the adjustments I can do at the moment with the perspective tool. So if I hit the return or the enter key, it will exit out of that tool and save my changes. So I'm going to go back to edit, and I'm going to scroll down again to transform, and now I'm going to try the skew. I'll caution you, you don't want to use the skew too terribly much if you can avoid it, just because it will distort the image, right? Because it's forcing it to take the shape that you're asking it to take. But if you sort of just zoom in, you can force these corners to take the shape that you need them to, right? So I'm going to sort of pull that down a little bit. It wants to lock to the grid, so you might have to play around with it a little bit and just sort of see if you can get it as close as you can. And if you zoom in, it will give you more freedom to pull things at smaller intervals. Whereas if you're zoomed out, it's going to be a little bit more abrupt, right? So I might try and pull this corner out just a little bit. Get that nice and lined up. The bottom looks fairly good. It sort of dips down here. Okay, let's see. Scroll back and look here. I'm not sure, so we can try and pull this out a little bit. But see, it's not going to want to go. It's going to want to stick to the square. So probably we'll leave that for right now. Okay, so if you zoom back out, right, we've got a fairly square situation happening. A good way to check, so if you see these rulers along the side and the top here, if you click over the ruler and then drag, you can line the ruler up and it should lock to the grid. So I'm just going to pull rulers all the way across. So if you just drag and then wherever you let go, it'll leave the ruler for you. So I'm going to drag one more down to the bottom. Right, so now I can zoom in and really see where I'm off. Right, so I'm going to want to go back to edit, transform, skew, and I'm going to want to zoom in a little bit more and try and force this corner up to square that out. Come over here, maybe try and pull this corner out and down a little bit. Okay, let's look at our top. Looks like the top corner here needs to be adjusted a little bit. Pull that down. Okay. So now we're looking pretty good, right? It's fairly square all the way around, barring the exception of this curvature here. Okay, so once your image is ready, if you click enter, it'll exit out of all the editing tools that you were in. I prefer at this point to go back to view and turn your grid off. So if you go back to view, show, and then grid, it's going to turn your grid off. And if you want to get rid of these lines, if those are bothering you, you can go again to view, and if you just click down here, clear guides, it's going to take all of those away, right? So now we're just looking at our image again. And what I'm going to go ahead and do next is we have all this white background happening, and we don't really need that. We're going to want to go ahead and get rid of that. So what I would recommend doing is going to, there's a couple different ways you can do this. So if you want to, you can take this rectangle tool and sort of trace around your rectangle. If you're gonna do it this way, I would recommend doing this prior to clearing your guides, because if you do that, then this line will snap to the guide you have set. So if you're doing it that way, right, so I've lined this up, I've essentially traced my square, but see, it's a little bit off on all the edges, right, which is why I would recommend having the guides. So if I hit Command Z to get rid of that, I zoom out a little bit, I'll go ahead and show you. So if I bring my guides back down and line them up and pull a guide over here, line that up, and then I'm going to pull one over here, and I'm going to line that up. Probably I'll just pull it in, right, and line it up with the inner part so that we don't end up with a strange gap, if that's making sense. So see, I've lined it up with the innermost part of that edge, which is what I would probably recommend you do if your edges happen to be a little bit strange. Okay. And then down here at the bottom, see, we're going to line it up at the bottom. Okay, so now we have our guides. So what we're going to do next is go back to our rectangle tool, and you can line up with this corner. If you want, you can zoom in if that's easier, and just line this up just like that. And you can click and drag. We're just going to drag it all the way down to this other guy, and it should snap for you, right? So now it's perfectly lined up with my guides. So I've got that, okay? So now, if you've done it this way, you've outlined with your rectangle, we're just going to get rid of this background. So we're going to go to the crop tool. This toolbar could shift depending on the computer that you're using, because the preferences aren't always set the same. If you're having trouble finding either the rectangle marquee tool or the crop tool, if they're not showing up here on this toolbar, you can also go to this search arrow here and type in the tool you're looking for, and it should come up for you. But the crop tool is just going to be this one that has two sort of triangles that are a little bit interlocked. I'm just going to click on that. And because I've made my rectangle with the rectangle marquee tool that I showed you here, the dotted lines, when I click the crop tool, it's automatically cropped to that square that I just formed. So I'm just going to want to make sure that these white corners are lined up with how I want, that the highlighted section is over my image, and then I can click return or enter, and it will go ahead and crop my image for me. You might have to click it more than once, or if you just go back to this cursor arrow when you're done, it will finish cropping it for you. Yeah. You have to finish getting out of the crop tool or really any of your editing tools before you can do anything else. If you're ever having trouble getting out of a tool, you can just click this arrow up here and it will take you back to a regular cursor that just allows you to move things around. Okay, so now we are left with just our image, and you have some options here. You shouldn't need to be color correcting very much, because if you take your images in the light box, you should have pretty consistent lighting, right? Like there's no crazy shadows, there's no glare happening. You can really see the texture of things that are going on, which is important. However, if things are feeling a little bit too dark or a little bit strange, you can go into okay. You can go to image adjustments. And these are going to be all of your color correction options. I'm not going to go into this a ton because, like I said, you shouldn't have to do it very much. But I will just sort of introduce you to a couple of the options in case you want to play around with them. But I want things to look as close to the actual square as possible, right? So you shouldn't be doctoring the image in a way that shifts it substantially from what the real square looks like. So I would probably start with brightness and contrast. There is an auto button. I don't recommend using it. It's better typically if you adjust it on your own, but you can play around with them. I think it's good to sort of see what they do, right? So if I click auto, but see, it sort of like washes out my whites. Everything looks a little bit too dramatic, right? It sort of loses its reality. So if I hit cancel, it will undo that. So if I go back to adjustments, brightness, contrast, I can play around with adjusting these, and you should be able to see it happen in real time, right? So that makes it darker. So maybe I just want to brighten up my whites just a little bit. Maybe play around with the contrast, make the blacks really pop a little bit. But see, it's still looking like a slightly enhanced version of what it was originally, right? I haven't drastically shifted any colors. So if I hit OK, it'll save those changes for me. You can also if you go to levels, you can play around with this a little bit, right? See how it's shifting the values in there. Yeah, so my recommendation would be just to go into image adjustments, maybe for your first one, and just play around with all of these options. Just so you sort of have an understanding of what they can do. If you have any questions, we can talk more if you want to talk about editing further. But I don't want to throw too much at you because, like I said, I just want you to make high quality images that look as close as possible to the real square. And the lighting setup that I have should do most of that work for you. You shouldn't have to do a ton of adjustments. So now if you are all finished, you've adjusted your colors as you want, your lighting, you've sized it down, cropped it, everything's square. We're going to now look at prepping it to export. So the last adjustment we need to do is we're going to go to image, and we're going to go to image size. If you just click that, this menu is going to come up, and you're going to want, so the original size is going to be whatever size the image was taken in. So when we pulled it in, nothing got adjusted. And right now it's over 34 inches, which is huge. So we're going to want to make that file just 4 inches by 4 inches. this lock should be on, which keeps everything in perspective. So since like it keeps it from forcing your image to be a certain shape. It keeps it the shape that it is currently, just with different ratios, right? So I would just type in 4 to one of them. The other one should be within a fraction of an inch if your squares are truly square. If you're getting anywhere past maybe like 3.90, I would start looking at retaking the image or recutting your square. And so then the other thing we're going to want to do is look at resolution. That should be at 300 dpi or pixels per inch. And that's just talking about the quality of the image. So you're going to want that to be really high quality. So now I have 4 inches by 4 inches, 300 dpi. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And you'll see my image got substantially smaller. But if I zoom in, all of the image quality is still there, right? I can see all the texture, everything that's happening. Okay, so the very last thing we need to do is export the image. So if we go up here to File, you'll want to make sure that you are in fact on your cursor, because if you're on any editing tool, it won't give you this menu as an option. And if we scroll down to Save As and click that, and then you're going to want to title this however you want to title it to make it easy for you to find. I would recommend titling them by number just so you can sort of keep track of them, but that's up to you, whatever your preference is. So for the sake of this, I'll just title it 1. And you can save it wherever you want. If you want to save it to a desktop or a flash drive, whatever's convenient for you, whatever makes sense. And then you're going to want to come down to Format and make sure that you are on a JPEG image. And you shouldn't need to mess with any of these other things. Just as long as this says JPEG, you should be good to go. And you'll just click Save. And then the secondary box is going to come up, and it's just asking you about the image quality. So since our images are small, they're only 4 inches by 4 inches, we shouldn't have any trouble with the size of the file. So I'm going to ask you to keep it at 12-point quality or maximum. All of these adjustments should be the same if you just drag this all the way up, or make sure it says maximum. It should be the default, but sometimes it's not. So once you make sure that that's at maximum quality, you can click OK. And you'll see it just popped up on my desktop. And I can open it up as an image, and it's just the square now as it is in real life. Okay, so you're going to want to go through all 16 of your images, and once you have them all, you've done all of your adjustments to them, you will save them into a folder with your last name, first name, 100 squares, and then upload those to BoxyBox and share the link with me. Just make sure that you get an external link made, which there's instructions for that on Carmen, but that you share that link through the Carmen submission portal for assignment 100 squares.